And for more on the global crisis, let's bring in Professor Leila Harris. She's co-director of the program on water governance at the University of British Columbia. Professor, thank you for your time this morning. Firstly, whether it's climate change, contamination, or overconsumption, the data and implications are clear that water scarcity is a serious issue. Is it being treated as such?
I think increasingly so. People recognize the seriousness, but still it's not always taken as a priority relative to some of the other priorities that we're dealing with. If we consider, for example, mining and other deforestation and other things that we know affect our waterways, often we can see that those permits are going through without due consideration for how they're affecting the waterways. So that in turn affects quality and so forth. We can also see there's been so many cities you mentioned just now in your report that we have anticipated water stress will be felt by many more globally and in a lot of different urban areas. But even if we look at the last 2 decades, about 80 cities or more have been facing very considerable water stress. And there's a couple key points just to add to what you've already cited. Not only do we have contamination, but often these are felt very unevenly. So when we say water insecurity, it's often certain populations, often the most vulnerable and marginalized, who are most affected. So how this plays out is also very important to look at and consider.
Professor Harris, some of your work has focused on the marketization of water. Economists argue that water markets is one of the most efficient ways to ensure that those who value, demand more water will get it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's many different angles to this, and we have the implementation of markets in a number of different areas. In certain cases, it can work in limited ways. So if you're thinking of trying to get rid of unproductive uses in certain agricultural sectors, maybe some sort of market or trading is appropriate. But the problem is that the discourse around water stress has been taken up by many policymakers and many people in private industry to suggest that, we just need markets and that will solve the problems writ large, or we need to, for instance, privatize water systems, especially in urban areas, and that will improve efficiency and solve this problem. But the data of the past several decades has shown it's not that simple. And in fact, it often can do considerable harm when we rely on those sorts of instruments to sort of deal with the issue, when we rely on private companies only without thinking about the capacity of governments and others to work on these issues. So I think depending on what we're talking about, it can be different, the answer, but it's quite clear that in a lot of ways, it's never that simple. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that we often are sort of focused on these issues of water stress and water insecurity from an economics angle or from an engineering angle. And I feel like those have contributed, that sort of sole focus in many ways, to worsening the crisis, instead of having a more comprehensive, holistic approach that also considers what are the social factors that lead to water insecurity, especially for certain populations. How do these play out differently in different social areas and different geographic areas? And so we really need a wider perspective when we think about the water crisis. The type of work that I've been trying to do, and many of my colleagues, is to think about water not simply as H2O, not just as a chemical property or something that we need to live and survive, but water is deeply embedded in our social systems and our economic systems. So if we're going to improve the situation of water insecurity for many, we have to think about those social systems and those economic systems and how they're affecting water and who can access water and why water becomes contaminated in different arenas. These are not simply economic problems and they're not simply engineering problems, but they're very deeply connected to our social systems, our political systems, and our economic systems. So the way we like to talk about it is to think about water as a social process and entity instead of relationships, as a political process instead of relationships, tied to political economy and economic systems, but not something that we can just solve by delivering water through pipes and creating more infrastructure. We have to think very deeply about our systems in a much more holistic way.
Yeah, and getting consensus on that holistic way will be a challenge in itself. The World Water Council President Loic Fouchon told CNA on World Water Day last month that we know the solutions, the technical digital solutions. We know what good governance could be, but we need political will, strong political will, he said, from politicians at all levels. Is that the bottleneck, do you think, political will?
At some level, it is, but we don't simply know the solutions because, as I was saying, they're much broader than simply providing water. We know how to treat water. Yes, that's clear. But we don't know how to make sure it gets to the most vulnerable populations or those people who can't afford it when we have different affordability crises, whether it's around food or water. These are basic needs that people need to live. But when we're having these other crises that are going on where people, have to decide and trade off between whether or not they're going to access food or water, we know that the questions and challenges are much deeper. So in terms of the political will, it goes back to the questions that I was mentioning. What are we willing to do differently so that we can safeguard water for more people, for all people, and also for animals and plants and other things in the ecosystem that require access to water. And, we probably cannot keep consuming many things, not just water, but many other things to the degree that we are. And even if we're trying to solve other sustainability challenges, for instance, if we're moving towards electric cars, electrification, that requires certain types of mining, which again affects our waterways. So we have to think very carefully and deeply about what are the ways in which we're going to be using water, how we're going to be affecting water, and what we can do differently. I also just want to caution, just going back to some of the statistics that were provided earlier, when we think about basic needs, the human right to water and domestic water, in general, that's a fairly small proportion of the water that we're talking about in terms of freshwater use. In most contexts, the majority of freshwater use is going to agriculture and also to industry. And a lot of the contamination is from certain industrial uses and mining and deforestation and other things. So often we group these together, but honestly, getting safe water to households for basic needs, for basic domestic needs, should be a relatively solvable problem. It's how do we consider and accept those bigger trade-offs in terms of reining in certain types of industry or deforestation or mining, not allowing it in certain waterways, or requiring that the pollution not be as considerable as we often allow, just because we're interested in the economic benefits of those activities. So the political will, it's not just, do we want access to water for all people, but how to think about it in a much bigger way to sort of preserve waterways for ecological needs and for the long term. And, thinking and seeing that domestic water use is really usually a very small piece of that pie.
All right, really appreciate your thoughts today, Professor. That was Leila Harris, co-director of the Program on Water Governance at the University of British Columbia.